Hello. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, where we unearth forgotten, hidden and often overlooked cultural histories, radical stories, secret lives and countercultural currents that have shaped our world. I'm Stephen, and as I record this, it's Pride this weekend in London. And so, in this episode, we're going to delve into a particular lost history, often a secret history, one that you might say has been hiding in plain sight for at least 5,000 years. My guest is Keith Stern, writer, researcher, longtime friend and collaborator with Sir Ian McKellen, who spent exploring the lives of queer figures from across the centuries. His book, Queers in History, is a rich, revelatory collection of over 1,000 individuals, famous, forgotten and often completely unexpected, whose sexuality put them at odds with the times they lived in, or whose stories have been carefully edited to fit a more acceptable historical narrative. You're going to find some familiar names: Oscar Wilde, Sappho, James Baldwin, but also many you might not expect. Florence Nightingale, not just the angel of the Crimea, but a woman whose passionate relationships with other women have left some tantalising clues. Marlene and Dietrich, wearing men's suits in Weimar, Berlin, and seducing across the genders. Cary Grant, his long relationship with fellow actor Randolph Scott, played out behind closed doors in Golden Age Hollywood. We're going to hear more about that later. This was a surprising one for me. J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, closet case supreme apparently, who possibly engaged in a secret relationship while persecuting others for theirs. Eleanor Roosevelt, Frida Kahlo, Tchaikovsky, Greta, Garbo, Richard the Lionheart, even Abraham Lincoln, all appear here in a galaxy of hidden lives. But Keith's book doesn't just offer speculation, it does weigh up the historical evidence, inviting us to consider how queerness has always existed, often hidden in coded language or cloaked in silence. It's more than a who's who, I'd say. It's a challenge to kind of official version of the past, and a reminder of how history gets made, unmade and remade, depending on who's telling it. We're going to talk about all that, and we're going to talk to Keith about what drove him to write this book, an endeavour that's lasted over 35 years, all the challenges of researching these secret lives, and of course why it matters. And, listeners, we're going to get into the subject of whether Gandalf was queer. Yes, really we are. Let's do it. Keith Stern. Keith, welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
I'm very happy to be here. I'm honored to be in the company of all of your other guests of the past.
Queers in History Volume 1 of 2, A to K, and Queers of History Volume 2 of 2, L to Z. This is an incredible book. We're going to talk about it, how you came to write it and or compile it, and you've been doing that for sort of 30 odd years, right?
I'm the only person you'll meet today who's compiled an encyclopedia over the course of 32 years.
Right, good. But before we dive into this, let's dive into the strange history of Keith Stern, because when I started to find out a bit more about you, the first thing that popped up was CBGBs.
Sure.
Tell us about how Keith got to CBGBs and what happened.
I always thought I'd wind up living in New York, but I never have. I've lived there for short periods of time, but otherwise I've lived in the outskirts of New York and just gone back and forth quite a bit. But I integrated myself somewhat into the fabric of New York City. And in particular, I found a shop called Magical Child, run by a fellow who was a bit notorious for running the only coven of witches in Manhattan. And I was perhaps about 14 or 15 years old, and so they kind of adopted me into their big family. We all dressed in black, of course, as most New Yorkers do, but we were really seriously about black. None of us could get any work anywhere. Nobody would hire these weird people, except for a fellow named Hilly Crystal, who had just opened a bar on the Bowery called CBGB. So we were probably the only people who would work for him, and he was probably the only person who would have us work for him. Just pitched in once in a while to kind of promote the place and hand out postcards and flyers and things like that, or design flyers and pass them out. And it was a very small scene. I mean, a good night for us might be 25 people in the bar. And there was no stage. And this is late 1973, early 1974, I suppose. At about the same time, I'd become exposed to Patti Smith. I had a musical background. I was a musician, but I could see a whole new world of music opening up. Hilly was not really in tune with that in the beginning. He was very ecumenical. He thought he'd have all different kinds of music in his bar. But gradually we took over, and it was all punk all the time. And he was perfectly happy to sell a lot of beer that way. But I do remember the earliest days, for instance, the very first time Ramones played CBGB. We knew they were coming in from Long Island. They pulled up, I think, in a Chevy van or something like that, or even a station wagon. I'm not sure, but it was piled high with all of their equipment. I helped load them in. We cleared away a few tables to make room for them to set their amps up on the floor. There was, like I said, there's no stage at that point.
Right, okay, so completely on the same level as the audience.
They were.
Right.
They were in the back.
Which is quite punk.
Absolutely. You know, we were winging it. They set up, I think they had to do 3 sets that night. And I took a seat toward the rear of the room, and my first thought was, this is the best bar band I have ever heard in my life. They were so good. And they were just exactly the way that very first time as they were 20 years later. I don't think they even got better. They just really were born that way.
It's funny because I can't remember the year, but I was in Manhattan when they were dismantling CBGB. So that would be sometime in the noughties. I can't remember. It's quite a while back, wasn't it? But, you know, I'm not from New York, obviously. I spent a lot of time there for a while. But it did feel like a kind of cultural icon was sort of disappearing because certainly from this side of the Atlantic, it just seems so much part of that New York punk scene, but also RT and all those bands, you know. It was quite poignant in some ways that it was being dismantled. I think somebody dismantled it and shipped it across to LA or something, is that right?
I haven't heard that. Whatever, it should have been preserved. It was a cultural icon. I myself got kind of bored with CBGB after about 1980. I think my last real moment at CBGB was when Johnny Rotten came to tell us that the Sex Pistols were not going to play CBGB. They had broken up in San Francisco, and that was the end of the band. And I felt that was really the end of that era for me.
Right.
I know it carries on in different forms.
Yeah.
But that was it for me.
There was a club here called the Roxy, which in some ways kind of performed the same sort of role, you know, somewhat the birthplace of punk. But, of course, you know, guests here have talked about there wasn't really a thing called punk. There was just all these bands, a lot of them sounding quite different than each other, you know. But the sort of journalists kind of turned it into this thing called punk.
Well,
really.
Exactly. I mean, I remember the first time I heard the word applied to the music that we were doing at CBGB. The local TV station had sent down a film crew to document the scene that was happening. We had Andy Warhol and a few other celebrities drop in. And so they became aware of what was going on downtown on the Bowery, where nothing was supposed to be happening. We're going to broadcast the show at 6 o'clock. So we all gathered around this little tiny TV in the box office at CBGB to watch the really first big news coverage of the club. And the reporter said, and downtown there's a scene of punk music. And we looked at each other and said, punk, that's what it is. So it was actually, I don't know exactly where they got the term from, but it stuck.
But I think you had concerts at REM, didn't you? Apart from the Ramones, the Go-Go's, Bow Wow Wow.
Oh, yeah.
You know, a time there. So
I became very close to REM because in their early days, I was operating a club of my own in Charlotte, North Carolina called the Milestone Club, which is still in existence and still pumping out a lot of good times. We gradually created a scene there, very much like CBGB. I thought time came for us to find a band from outside of our local area. So I called a friend in Atlanta who had heard REM play. They had never been out of the state of Georgia, had only played their hometown of Athens, Georgia, and a couple gigs in Atlanta. On her recommendation, I hired them, and they came up to play the Milestone, their very first booking out of state. They had no place to stay, so they stayed at my house, of course. And they continued to stay at my house over the next 2 or 3 years as they toured the Southeast whenever they stopped in Charlotte. I was just a couple blocks from the recording studio, Reflection Sound, where they did their first 2 or 3 albums. And so it was very convenient. They'd pull up. They'd all pile out of the car they were in or the van that they were in, carrying bags of noodle ramen and whatever other cheap food they could, heat up in my kitchen. And became very close to them.
Well, they did very well, didn't they?
Yeah.
So there was that, but then also Warner Brothers. Tell us about that.
I got in enough trouble in Charlotte creating too much fun. I had to go. I got basically chased out of town. And I never thought I'd live in Los Angeles because I don't like smog. But I had a few friends in the music business in LA, and I had the promise of a job at Warner Brothers if I wanted to go to their headquarters in Burbank. So I did head for the West Coast, 1982, settled in Hollywood, and went to work for Warner Brothers, where they put me in the IT department, which was cool because I liked computers, still like computers. Frankly, I was the only person there who knew how to operate a remote workstation. I started exploring all the databases that I had suddenly access to and learned about what kind of music was popular in Berlin, what kind of music was popular in Mexico City, all over the world. Different kinds of music were popular. And so I started recommending, I was friendly with the A&R department. Those are the people who decide who's going to get signed to the label. And so I did my best to influence them. And I certainly recommended that they sign REM. And eventually Warner Brothers did sign them as soon as they got together $80 million, which was what it cost them.
Ouch. Yeah. Right, that's expensive.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot of money. Amazing.
They had to think about it a little while.
Yeah, I bet. Hope they didn't put too much pressure on you. It's like, we just spent $80 million on this. If this doesn't work out, you're out.
I can tell you, I felt that pressure, really.
I bet really you did.
A few years before moving to California, I had actually worked for Johnny Cash. I developed an incredible program for him that took in all the music's royalty statements from around the world. And so this program was very clever about exchange rates and all that, and getting the checks out to all the songwriters in there.
Bless you.
It's always been a weird combination of entertainment business and computer business for me, but who would have realized that the two would merge the way that they have.
Right,
really.
Well, let's come on to that, because there's this thing called the CD-ROM. Now, younger listeners are going to be like, what? What's that? You probably heard of a CD at least, but CD-ROM was... Well, it looked like a CD, but it was basically data, wasn't it? You could put it in your computer and it would spring up and you could sort of interact with it in some way. That was it, wasn't it? A CD-ROM.
Yeah, it was like a self-contained app, complete with the database and everything. Yeah.
No archaic piece of lost culture, let's call it that. You used this to the first iteration of Queers in History, right? Okay. Why and how? And what gave you the idea to do this? And how did you even start doing it?
Well, people who know me know I can get obsessed about things. And those obsessions usually last about a year. And so they'll feed me ideas. I love learning about things I don't know about. And I stumbled across something that I didn't know anything about, which was historically gay, lesbian, bisexual people. It started reading when I read a magazine article about Leonardo da Vinci. And it told all about his artwork and his scientific work. And it just casually mentioned that he was homosexual. Just that one line. I kind of scratched my head and I thought, I read the same thing about Michelangelo a few weeks ago. And again, it was a detailed story of his life and just mentioning that he had same-sex orientation.
Like as a footnote?
Just a footnote, yeah. Toward the end of it, the historian would just drop that in, or the writer would just drop that in as a juicy tidbit without any facts or justification or details. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. And I figured if I spent a week in the library, I would come up with 50 famous people through history who were gay, lesbian, bisexual. And sure enough, after a week or two, I had 100.
How did he do that at that time?
Every library had an index. It would be the size of a room, shelves and shelves of index cards. And you could go to the H's and you'd find a section of homosexuals, or homosexuality. And you would just, you could start there in the H's if you wanted to. But I also had a kind of an inkling about who might qualify and who wouldn't. Right,
so you might have an instinct, maybe a feeling in your waters, should we say, this person's worth checking out.
Yeah, and one person led to another, as they do. So that was the trail of breadcrumbs that I followed. But like I say, after just a couple weeks, I had 100 of them, and being a computer geek, I put them into a database, and I put it on a diskette. Those are even older than CD-ROMs, 3.5 inches square. It contained about 1/1000th of the capacity of a CD-ROM, but it was enough to hold 100 names and birth dates, death date, a little bit of information about them. And I developed a little app to run the database. I took it down to the local bookstore on Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood, and the manager there, Mark Simon, took a look at my diskette on his little computer in the back room. He said, oh, this is kind of cool. Why don't you make up a dozen of them for me, and I'll put them on the shelf, and we'll see what happens. So I ran off to the office supply store and bought lots of pink paper and labels and envelopes and diskettes, and ran off a dozen of them, put them in a box, and brought them to him. I went back 2 or 3 days later to see if he had sold any, and I couldn't find it anywhere. It was gone. And I assumed he had given up on them and thrown them in the trash or something, or was holding them for me to pick up. But indeed, he had sold them all.
Where's the next lot?
That's right. And I eventually sold 600 copies just in that one store. And gradually expanded it to about 400 people. And at that point, I had to put it on CD-ROM. And the CD-ROM was a really attractive package. I had special artwork designed for the packaging, and it was sophisticated for its time. The kind of thing that normally would be sold in an electronics store. That's where you'd find, quote, software. And you wouldn't find anything like it in a bookstore. But I packaged my CD-ROM to look like a book, and I sold 600 stores around the world, including London, as the very first new media title that they put on their shelves, and they sold a lot of them.
Do you know who the audience was? You know, who was buying them?
I heard from all different kinds of people. I heard from young people. I heard from older people. I got lots of letters, just people who were grateful to have the information out there.
Yeah.
So it was a wide audience. Yeah. I'd say mostly queer people. I don't think there were a lot of strictly heterosexual people who were particularly interested in the subject. And for that matter, I'm not sure there are that many today. Although I think of it more as just a book of general interest history that focuses on an area that's been left out of most history.
I'd say so. But it transferred to printed form, book form. Along the way, you're gathering more and more names.
Yeah. Well, that was funny because we went from being on a CD-ROM, the newest technology, to being in a trade paperback book, which is the oldest technology, perhaps, or other than papyrus. I had, I think, 3 agents probably, and they sent it around to a bunch of publishers and didn't have a great deal of interest, but one of them took a copy of the book home, the manuscript, and left it on his table, and his wife picked it up. And she read a bit of it. She said, "You've got to publish this book." So he did, and it went through 3 printings, and it was a pretty good success for him. And now it's 16 years between the paperback in one volume, which had about 800 people in it, and today's completely revised, completely updated, and completely expanded 2025 edition of Queers in History in 2 volumes, audiobook, ebook, paperback, and hardcover. It's got over 1,000 people in it.
It's extremely informative, surprising, I'd say, as well, sometimes entertaining, tragic. It's got a bit of everything for everybody. I mean, and it is a monumental thing. And it is the first comprehensive biographical compendium of important historical and contemporary figures, you know, from those communities, right? You know, I mean, I think it was gay, lesbian, and bisexual mainly, wasn't it? And I think in recent years you've put more transgender people in it. But I mean, 5,000 years of history. Yeah. You know, said over 1,000 stories, artists, leaders, revolutionaries, thinkers, politicians, right across the culture, right? And it also sort of explores in some ways how their private life, and maybe mainly had to be secret life, affected their work.
That was one of the things that surprised me as I wrote it, was that I continued to bump into the fact that if these people hadn't been queer, they wouldn't have done what they did. They were greatly impacted by their sexuality, as probably everybody is, one way or another. And I mean, isn't that the reason we do stuff?
I interviewed John Savage, the punk chronicler, you know, music journalist. John wrote this book, The Queer Life of Pop, about histories of queer people in the entertainment industry. And of course, you realise the massive contribution that they made to music and entertainment. But it was quite a particular contribution. It wasn't just that they happened to be queer and were successful musicians. It was like something from their life, their private, secret, often life, fed into what they did, and in so doing transformed the culture.
Exactly. I mean, in the music business in particular, I hope he pointed out that most of the rock and roll managers of that era were gay.
He did.
And they just loved signing these sexy groups of men to go and perform for them around the world, and made a great success from the Beatles on down. Brian Epstein being gay, of course, and in love with John Lennon, no doubt. I mean, that had everything to do with the success of the Beatles. Without a gay man behind them, they wouldn't have been who they were. They didn't have to even be gay themselves. That was a theme that developed, and it's the exact opposite of what a traditional historian will tell you. A traditional historian who's been properly educated in the university will come and tell you that it didn't matter if they were gay or not.
Right, so it would be the way that you described it at first. You got Michelangelo, you got Leonardo da Vinci. They're these great artists, you give them their history, and then at the bottom there's a footnote saying, oh, by the way, they were gay. You're suggesting that having published these biographies of over 1,000 people, that something about their queerness actually made them who they were, and in terms of if they were creatives in some way, what they produced.
I think that this book proves that point, and it's something that all historians should note, whatever their topic. It's a very important element of the individual lives, and it's always left out of the history books. I mean, we don't know why all these generals and kings, and we don't know what motivated them, but in the end, there had to be a bit of sex in it, don't you think?
I'm guessing so, yes. For listeners, give us one of these 1,000 people that you'd like to pick out of the hat and tell us a little bit about.
We've been talking about Leonardo. Very importantly, he left some of his more important paintings to his young, wicked boyfriend named Salai. And Salai inherited the Mona Lisa. If he hadn't left that painting to his boyfriend, it might have easily have been lost. So the act of transferring that artwork to his lover preserved it in a way that it might not have been preserved otherwise. For an example story, let's just go back to the beginning. 2450 BC is as far back as I went. That was ancient Egypt, where in 1964, archaeologists discovered a lavishly illustrated, decorated tomb. And inside, where they expected to find a man and a woman, they found two men, depicted as kissing and embracing and going through their daily lives together. They were the manicurists to the pharaoh. They kept the pharaoh styled, and probably the family too. So they were important, wealthy, aristocratic couple named Niank-Num and Num-Hotep. Notice that in the middle between them is that word Num, Niank-Num and Num-Hotep. That conjunction of those two names is a little bit like saying Mr. and Mr. Num.
The Nums, right.
They were the Nums. And they had a very spectacular tomb. I'm hoping to be able to go further back in some revised edition, because recently a tomb was discovered from 26,500 BC. And it was 3 people buried in the tomb. They determined that they were young people, teenagers. One was 15, one was 16, and one was either 19 or 20. The one on the right was buried face down. The one on the left was buried with his hand on the crotch of the pelvic area of the person in the middle, decorated in ochre, very expensive red ochre on the head and the pelvic areas. And so naturally the archaeologists assumed that the person in the middle was a woman, and this was a sexually provocative manner. And quite a few months went by before they did enough tests to determine that the person in the middle was not a woman, but was a man. It was 3 guys buried together in a very provocative pose. And so tomb is continuing to be studied, and we don't really have any conclusions to make, and we may never know for sure what that was all about. But it illustrates how the experts always jump to a conclusion that it's a heterosexual relationship going on there.
And in the light of what they found, did they revise that conclusion?
They have revised that. They know it's a very intimate burial of some sort. Maybe that person in the middle was a very important figure who, when he died, they buried 2 of his companions with him, willingly or unwillingly. They're still studying that, but it's certainly intriguing.
These are lost histories then, aren't they? And they're lost because of the way that, or the kind of view, the reality tunnel, as it were, that people have approached them with, right?
It's prejudice, yes.
Prejudice, yeah. So one of the things which this encyclopedia does is attempt to add something to history, right, as well as providing a lens to look at the lives of certain people. And so as you started to uncover more and more people who are queer, or at least you could speculate so, right, that's what started to inform a belief that queerness also would affect the way they lived, the things that they did, the way that the art that they produced, for instance.
Right. These are things that I learned. Like you said, I've tried to keep it entertaining too. I mean, the biggest fear in my life is that I should be boring for a minute.
There's no chance of that. Not in this. There's some very nice reviews at the front here. The Hartford Courant, which sounds like a fairly traditional paper, says, tells you who did what and who did whom. And Kit Ronan, the LA Reader, said, queer history comes out of the closet. It is very entertaining. And of course, your friend, and you know who you're staying with at the moment, Ian McKellen-Syrian, who wrote the foreword for this, right, and says, prepare to be surprised. There's quite a few, I didn't know that moments. Did you find some of those moments? Even though you're on the lookout, did you think, wow, well, I never would have thought he, she, they were that way?
Oh, well, there were many, but one in particular stands out for me as an American who grew up in Chicago, went to the public schools, where every classroom had a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, who was the local boy who'd done good. the 16th president of the United States. He's the president who took the country through the Civil War and kept the Union, kept the country together, for what it's worth now. And so he's an American hero, and many people consider him to be the best U.S. president. And I thought I knew everything there was to know about Abraham Lincoln, but after I published the book the first edition, people started coming up to me and saying, "Oh, have you heard this about Abraham Lincoln? Gay gossip, about Honest Abe, who didn't look the part, and as far as I knew, had not acted the part." And so I said to myself, I'm going to find out for sure that it's not true. I'm going to go do some research, back to the library, read about Abe Lincoln and prove that he wasn't gay, and I don't have to write him up in my book. Save myself a little trouble. But of course, the more I looked into it, the more I found out, and it's pretty amazing how much information there is about this particular person. It's very important in American history, and I would think even in world history. But even if he had never become a lawyer and had never entered politics and had never become president, he'd be remembered today as a poet, and as the poet who wrote the very first, earliest gay poem in American literary history. In 1829, he published in the local newspaper a poem about two boys who get married and try to have a child.
Wow.
No,
Right.
Nothing earlier in American literature on that kind of a topic. And, of course, the locals loved it. They thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever read in their local paper. And when he became president, and people would go back to his old hometown in Indiana and talk to them about what they remembered about old Abe, that's what always came up, was that gay poem that he wrote.
What about James Buchanan, 15th President of the United States?
That's true, too.
Personal life long been the subject of historical debate, an exceptionally close relationship with his male roommate, William Rufus King, to the extent that they were colloquially referred to as the Siamese twins.
Yeah.
Right?
There was no doubt in people's mind what was going on there.
There was no doubt about it at the time.
No doubt about it at the time. I mean, people knew about these relationships. You couldn't really hide it in such a close society.
Well, that in itself is interesting, isn't it? Because they knew about it. It was never spoken about, never written about, but it was tolerated, right? So
Absolutely.
we often think about, from the counterculture onwards, that we live in sort of very liberal times and assume that the past was not so, but it often was, wasn't it? But just there was this one rule, which is that don't talk about it.
Yeah, people accepted it to the point where they didn't really talk about it much. They might make a little snide note in their diary, but it was not considered a topic fit for publication in a newspaper, for instance. There was no scandal tinge involved in it. People just thought it was a peculiarity and no more. And so it wasn't anything that, certainly politicians would try to use it against other politicians and imply that they were something less than 100% man. But they did a lot of things like that in other ways too. So when you look at tolerance, I look back at even at ancient Egypt, where, like I said, the pharaoh employed a gay couple to take care of him and his family, not only tolerated, but revered them and treasured them and appreciated them. Just a couple hundred years later, one of the pharaohs himself was accused of having a homosexual relationship with one of his generals. And basically, the people surrounding the king just shouted the guy down and told him to go away. We don't want to hear your nasty rumors about our pharaoh.
Of course, we know about Greece, where it was kind of just part of society, completely embedded, right? There were some surprising things for me. I mean, Sitting Bull, the legendary Lakota leader, is famous for this resistance against the US government, and his role in the Battle of Little Bighorn. But one of his two wives was a man, two-spirit man, they called it. It's two-spirit identity, a term used by indigenous North Americans to describe individuals who embody both masculine and feminine spirits, right? Often holding significant spiritual and social roles within the community.
Sure. Gay people were the shamans, the wizards, the witches that people looked up to as being special. And so these people who didn't necessarily have the normal responsibilities of raising a family could spend time exploring the spiritual nature of the universe, and they were regarded as guiding lights for the community. And virtually every Native American tribe had what they called a berdache, who was a spiritual leader who was queer. And it didn't take, within days of discovering America, the Spanish discovered that there were homosexuals all over the place in the New World. And this upset them quite a bit, and they did everything they could to destroy as much of it as they could, as quickly as they could. And that is the story of colonialism around the world, where there were many, many indigenous cultures in Asia, Africa, and it was used as a tool to divide people and to separate people and to suppress people. If you made something illegal, whether it was drugs or sex or whatever, if you could impose your artificial laws and rules against it, you had a tool to use to pressure people to do what you wanted them to do. And these laws were never evenly applied, of course. They were applied only against the people that you wanted to get out of the way. That's the role that queer people played in colonial times. They were perceived as being perhaps a little weak and perhaps a little disorganized. They had never felt any need to get organized to resist persecution. And so they were easy targets, and that's bullies prey on easy targets. And we need to remember that as we have to stand up to bullies every day now.
Yes, and of course, in these histories, there's some surprising things, but there's also some tragic stories. In one of the most tragic for this country, I think, is Alan Turing. Everybody's familiar with Alan Turing now because of the role that he played, and probably quite close to your heart as a computer scientist, right, as well. And his genius with artificial intelligence and decoding broke those Nazi codes in World War II. Credited with shortening the war. So saving
honored for shortening
the war, saved countless lives. Despite all that, prosecuted by the very nation that he'd say for gross indecency for being gay.
By petty people.
Subjected to chemical castration.
Prison or castration. He wouldn't have liked prison very much, but castration was not a pleasant thing for him either. We have every reason to believe that he was driven to suicide by these petty people.
It's a kind of tragedy anyway for anybody, but given what he'd done, given his contribution, it's absolutely extraordinary, isn't it?
But he had to keep it secret.
Yeah,
he couldn't tell the judge about what he had done. That wasn't a factor. He was just some guy who needed to be get out of the way and needed to be disposed of.
Hans Christian Andersen. That was both surprising for me, the beloved Danish author of all those fairy stories, which are kind of quite Christian and sort of moral, aren't they?
Well, on the surface they are, but when you dig deeper, there are darker themes to his stories as there are to all fairy tales.
His personal life was desperate, wasn't it?
He was queer, but he really didn't want to be. And he suppressed it as much as he could, and it caused him to be miserable. But out of that came these wonderful stories. What can you say? These wonderful stories where he was able to express himself. His personal life was not his outlet, but his stories were. So
you think there's something there whereby the inability to express it or to be it somehow gets sublimated into the work?
The work takes on a life of its own that the person cannot experience in their own real life. It's very sad that he felt that at that time in that place, he couldn't be who he was. He turned it to advantage by creating these incredible fantasies.
Here is a sidebar about the queer life of the Chevalier d'Eon. Born in Burgundy in 1728 with the splendidly long name Charles Geneviève Louis Auguste André Timothée d'Eon de Beaumont, the Chevalier d'Eon was, depending on who you asked, a diplomat, a soldier, a cross-dressing curiosity, a French patriot, a British pawn, a woman, a man, or something altogether more enigmatic. What we know for certain is this: d'Eon lived one of the most astonishingly queer lives of the 18th century. Quite a bit of it right here in Soho, in London. He first arrived in 1763, having already served as a secret agent in Russia for Louis XV. There are tales he'd infiltrated the Russian court disguised as a woman, charming the Empress while feeding intelligence back to Versailles. And it was this knack for disguise, for double dealing, for living multiple lives that became the hallmark of his life. In London, d'Eon was meant to serve as a diplomatic attaché, but the moment he stepped foot on English soil, rumours began. Was the Chevalier, in fact, a woman? London society couldn't stop speculating. Gossip columns exploded, caricatures circulated, and at the London Stock Exchange, bets were placed, literal financial bets, on the Chevalier's gender. One man even offered to perform a physical inspection. D'Eon, ever the graceful aristocrat, responded not with outrage, but with a fencing sword. And fencing became part of his story, as we will hear. By the late 1770s, the Aeon, still presenting as male in public, began privately asserting that he'd been signed female at birth and was forced to live as a man to serve the king. Now, whether this was a calculated ploy for safety or an evolving expression of gender identity, who knows? But the French crown, I think in an incredible rare act of bureaucratic flexibility, agreed Louis XVI officially recognised the Aeon as a woman. With one condition: she must dress as one. So the Chevalier returned to France wearing powdered wigs, courtly gowns, corsets, all the frills of female aristocratic fashion. She claimed this was not a costume, but a return to her true self. Eventually, the Aeon came back to London, this time living openly as a woman. But her later years were not so glamorous. The French Revolution had ended her royal pension and she was in prison for debt. She carried on fencing for money, still wearing dresses, still astonishing audiences. At one exhibition match, the crowd watched this lady gracefully disarm a male opponent with a flourish of her rapier. They cheered, not just for her skill, but for her defiance, for living in a way that no one quite understood, but couldn't look away from. When she died in 1810, aged 81, a post-mortem examination revealed what doctors called perfect male organs. The newspapers went wild. But I think to reduce D'Aeon's life to this question of anatomy is to miss the point. She just lived outside the conventions of their time and, as far as they could, true to themselves, with flamboyance, courage, contradiction and flair. And London loved them for it. Did you come across anybody who you think, oh, never would have thought that?
Many. I was surprised by practically every one, because I went in with the attitude, I'm going to research and prove they were not gay. Until it was proved otherwise to me, I wouldn't include them. And so, gosh, the big ones, Shakespeare. He's always been in my book. A.L. Rouse, leading expert on Shakespeare, and who was queer, openly queer himself, totally open about his sexuality, same-sex orientation, but was convinced, or at least tried to convince us, that Shakespeare was not gay.
Why?
Because he was married and had children. That's the only reason. But you could say that about Oscar Wilde.
Why did he feel it necessary to convince, though?
Something about the people who have studied Shakespeare, because they've known from the beginning that he was queer. From the 17th century, they've known he was queer. He wrote those sonnets, for goodness sake.
Dedicated to Mr. W.H.
Yeah, how do you explain that? Since 1609, they've been trying to explain why Shakespeare wasn't gay, because they think it lessens his stature somehow.
And yet this is an openly gay academic who's also trying to do it.
Very strange. I respect Rouse, and so I have to take him seriously, and Shakespeare's not gay. And all the experts, Schoenbaum, all the leading Shakespeare experts will tell you flat out, William Shakespeare was absolutely heterosexual. Until recently, because we couldn't find a man on the other side of the equation, other than Mr. W.H., the young man that he wrote the sonnets to. Well, we had him. That should be enough. We know that Shakespeare lived in London for many years apart from his family. He had a sexual life. We don't know much about it. What I've been looking for all these years is that other guy. And we're starting to get some information that there was another guy. I'm the only one who's published this so far, and I've been in touch with some of the other Shakespeare scholars, and they appreciate my research, and they are going to include my research in their future work, but they're still a little bit jittery about it. There's a fellow named John Robinson who turns up over and over again in Shakespeare's life. They turn up to be neighbors when they were in their early 20s, living in the same neighborhood, maybe living together, maybe living next door to each other. Then they both turn up on the South Bank, living in near proximity to each other, if not with each other. When Shakespeare's dying, the only person who visited him from London that we know of on his deathbed was John Robinson, who witnessed his will. 3 years before he died, Shakespeare bought a house in London. And you can read every expert on Shakespeare. Not one of them is going to say anything, but we have no idea why he bought this house. It's a total mystery.
You think he bought it for him?
Yeah. And he made sure in his will that it was mentioned that John Robinson lives in this house in London.
What about Willem Arendeus, the Dutch artist? Tell us about him.
He was the gay hero who was caught and executed. And in front of the firing squad, he said, "Let it be known that homosexuals are not cowards," as the guns are pointing at him.
His story is particularly moving because, I mean, he not only tried to blow up the Dutch records office so that the records of who's Jewish and who's not Jewish were completely eradicated, but then when caught, declares this as his last words, right? "I'm gay and fuck you." It's kind of, isn't it, really?
Exactly.
It seems to me that these books, as well as providing the kind of historical encyclopedia reference, they also act as a means of empowerment. Particularly, I'm thinking for younger people who are queer or wonder if they are, wonder what that means. You got these examples from history, from across the culture, all sorts of people. Was that part of the intention for you?
I think it's important for young people to have role models, and very important for young people to know that they're not alone.
Right.
This is a very common feeling among queer people when they reach a certain age and they realize there's something different about them, and they get kind of hints that maybe there's something wrong with them. They look around and they see nothing. They have nothing to look for to reassure themselves that they're okay. But any one of them can look in this book and find 1,001 reasons why they're okay. Of course, I mean, I can't say that everybody in my book is okay. There are a lot of villains in my book. I mean, Ernst Röhm, who was Hitler's closest friend and ally and who created the SS to protect Hitler, was an openly gay man. And Hitler knew he was gay, and everybody knew he was gay. And it was a great arrangement for them because Röhm had protection from Hitler. Nobody could touch him for being gay. He could do whatever he wanted. And Hitler always felt he had that card up his sleeve if he really needed to put some pressure on Röhm. And eventually he did have Röhm executed in 1938.
Yeah, I don't think you make the case that because you're queer, you're good, necessarily.
No.
There's plenty of, as you say, villains and
well, I guess if
despots.
somebody wants to grow up to be an SS leader, I guess they can find some inspiration in that story. Hopefully they are lessons of what not to be. And I include even some contemporary people in that category.
What about you? How was it for you to come out? You didn't have this book. Did you have role models, mentors?
It's kind of funny because when I look back, they were there, but I didn't recognize them. I mean, I drove Allen Ginsberg around Washington, D.C. for a couple days when I was 20. I don't know how I would have responded if he had tried to hit on me, which I don't know why he didn't. At any rate, he didn't. And I didn't fully understand that he was queer. I was a rather late bloomer, actually, partly because of being queer. I just didn't think that much about sex until I was in my early 20s.
Because it was too confusing, or?
Yeah, I had no idea. I mean, I loved women, I knew that. And I was fascinated by boys, and I knew that. But I couldn't really reconcile it all until much later. And when I was in my 30s is the first time that I said, "Come on, quit fooling around, you're gay." And
said it to yourself,
well,
said it to the world.
When you publish a book called Queerness History, which I did when I was just 39. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much it. You're out.
So for you, a slow process, but not necessarily a terribly painful one.
No. I experienced a little bit of bullying in school. Nothing terrible because I was well protected by the girls and who threatened to, not talk to their boyfriends if they gave me any trouble. So I was always a bit blessed in that way that I had friends who protected me from the worst of bullying and things like that. So I know a lot of people who got worse than I did. Yeah, well, I interviewed Tom Robinson about coming out in the counterculture, as it were, and Tom, who later went on to, write UK's gay anthem, Glad to be Gay, and sure,
and with his band became very successful in that post-punk world, right? And these days is a very well-respected broadcaster, but he went through hell. Yeah, he nearly committed suicide. I think he made an attempt to commit suicide, which failed. Thankfully.
Breaks my heart.
Really desperate. Yeah. What about, how do you sort of choose things? So one question would be, you've been sort of slightly criticised for including Angelina Jolie on the basis that, is she or isn't she? Is it speculation? Or do you ever think, they are, but maybe I shouldn't put them in because they might not want to be in? Or
yeah, absolutely. My rule is that anyone who has denied being queer has the right to stay out of my book, certainly while they're alive. I mean, most of the contemporary people in my book who aren't necessarily waving a gay pride flag around every day They've given an interview or two where they've let it slip out occasionally, and that's really enough for me. But you have to read the entry and make your own decision. I don't expect people to take every word I write as the gospel truth. I want to stimulate thought and stimulate maybe more research. And I've tried to avoid what you would call speculation. And I did cut 2 or 3 people from the latest edition where the evidence just wasn't there. I'm not saying they weren't queer, but the evidence just wasn't there, so they're gone. I mean, there may be 1 or 2 more that I should cut that I haven't cut, but those that are in there, I'm pretty confident they deserve a place in there. And the rule always was that there was strong reason to believe, that they had at least one intimate physical relationship with a person of the same sex. And that was a pretty good rule for a while, but it leaves out a lot of territory. It leaves out a lot of trans people and cross-dressers. And I mean, I had plenty of trans people right from the beginning, I thought. I heard from the trans community that I didn't. And so I've made some effort, and it's a very rewarding effort to include more fascinating, fabulous trans people in the latest edition. I mean, some of the best stories are about the trans people who overcame whatever prejudice they encountered there, and they're the bravest people in my book, probably. So the rule is kind of had to be expanded from a physical act to more of an intention in one way or another, that they're nonconformists sexually or in gender. It's a lot more complicated today than when I started, but I'm trying to keep up.
Has anybody ever written to you and said, actually, would you mind taking me out of your book?
Very interesting that you ask, because I did have a couple requests like that. I mean, for instance, I was good friends with Kevin Spacey. When he first came to Hollywood, I picked him up at the airport and took him to his friend's house where he was sleeping on the couch. He was born in Los Angeles, but he had gone to New York, done a few plays, and then came back to become a film actor, became friends. And so, of course, we all knew he was gay, and all my friends who knew I was writing this book said, are you going to put Spacey in there? But I knew Spacey didn't want to be in my book. So I never considered putting him in my book. And one day I was meeting another mutual friend at a restaurant called Hugo's, very popular with the Hollywood crowd. I noticed a fellow in the booth next to me slouched over with his hat over his face. I didn't think much of it, didn't recognize him. And then my other friend came up to meet me, came up to my table, looked beyond me and said, oh, hi, Kevin. What you doing? And so Kevin, who did not want to talk to me at that point because he knew I was writing this book, emerged from under that hat. So he never was in the book until recently.
Just on that note, how did you feel about what happened with him, when he was wrongfully accused of things here, during his tenure here, and then he came out, didn't he? But in a way, he was somehow forced out, wasn't he, against his will? That's what it felt like anyway.
I think he kind of used coming out as a bit of a distraction, if anything, too. So, I mean, Kevin had an unbelievably difficult childhood. I mean, his father just twisted him up and made him a mess. And you can't excuse what the person that Kevin is, although, of course, he's a brilliant actor, one of the most brilliant ever. And it has to be partly for that reason that he's so good at being a chameleon and so good at what he does. We live in a world where brilliance is not compensation enough for doing evil things, and he was certainly capable of doing evil things, particularly when he was under the influence of alcohol. So I think alcohol was a bigger problem than sexuality for Kevin. It's just my opinion.
He didn't ask to be removed, but he sort of made it clear that he didn't want to be included, let's put it that way, right? But
he made it clear he didn't want to be included.
But you have had people who've written to you and said, hey, would you mind dropping me from your book?
I'll tell you what I did have. I included Cary Grant, who's a member of my family, actually. My cousin married his only child. So I got a little blowback from my family about that. And his lover, his famous lover in Hollywood, was Randolph Scott, the actor. They lived together as a gay couple in Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. And they were about as open as you can be. And even back in New York, Cary Grant had lived with a gay fashion designer. It's all over Cary Grant's history, and Randolph Scott, too. They're both long dead by the time my book got published, but soon afterward I got a phone call from a fellow who told me, I'm Randolph Scott's son, and you should not put him in your book. It's rude to include him, blah, blah, blah. And all I could say was, I don't mean it to be an insult. That these two men loved each other is not a bad thing. And we kind of ended the conversation on that note. I mean, he was definitely wanted me to remove his father from my book.
Why would be the question. The issue was that some shame or something? Or didn't want to be known as the son of somebody who was queer?
It's possible that he didn't know.
So he was correcting facts then, or as he saw it?
The basis of his call was to correct the fact. But he called me back a week later, and I guess he'd done a little looking around himself and maybe consulting with some other members of his family. And he said, "You're right, Keith. There's nothing wrong with two men who love each other, and you can keep in the book."
Happy ending.
Yeah.
You mentioned over the recent editions you've included more trans people, and there's some fascinating stories. Deborah Sampson, this figure from the American Revolution, served as an heroic soldier in the Continental Army by disguising herself as a man. And after her military service, the story gets even weirder. She marries another woman, right?
Yeah.
But
she loved women.
Right. When her true identity, including her gender and her relationship, is discovered, she's denied her veteran's pension. And that's not the only time that happens, right?
It's happening today, I think. I just went to a meeting of gay veterans here in London. And they told some horror stories about what happened between 1967, when homosexuality was legalized in England, and the year 2000, when it was finally okay to be in the military service. Between 67 and 2000, you couldn't serve in the military if you were gay, hidden or not. If they discovered or suspected that you were gay, you'd be called into the office, and they'd say, "Well, we've heard some things about you. Do you have homosexual tendencies?" And your choice was either to lie and say no, which would make them very happy, and they'd keep you in the service. Or you could be an honorable person in your mind and say, "Yes, I do," and you'd be gone. They would escort you off the base from that office. You may have been 13, 15, 18 years in the service, and it was all gone. No benefits, no pensions, nothing.
That's the particularly cruel thing, it seems to me, is that now we know this fact about you, you're out, but then to take away something that you've already earned.
It's shocking. And one of the people I talked to was an officer who served her full 30-year term and had to process these people. She had to ask the question, "Do you have homosexual tendencies?" And she had to get rid of the people who answered yes. And it was really that simple. They wanted you to lie. I'm sure a lot of people did lie, and good on them.
One thing which gave me a little bit of pleasure, Keith, was that I discovered somebody who's not in your book.
Oh,
and I thought I'd tell you today. Okay. On this subject, Mary Read, born in England, raised as a boy by her mother, so she could receive financial support from a deceased relative. In other words, the relative was prepared to shell out if she had a boy, but not if she had a girl. Okay, so Mary's brought up, as dressed as a boy, which she carries on into adulthood. Serves in the military, right? But this is the fascinating thing. A Londoner too, joins a pirate crew, so she became a pirate, right? Aboard the pirate ship captained by Calico Jack Rackham. This bit's not included in Pirates of the Caribbean, as far as I remember. And so she only revealed that she was a woman to a few close companions. And one of those was Anne Bonny, who also disguised herself as a man to become a pirate. So there we go, you see. I've just dropped into it for the next edition.
I love it. I need all the help I can get.
The cross-dressing pirates.
I can do a whole pirate section. All those people on that boat, for all those months, they had to do something.
Come on, what were they up to?
Yeah, what
were they up to, right? I've just suggested to them, but do you get people now writing to you saying, "Hey, Keith, you forgot this person," or "You got to include this person," or...
I do. And oftentimes it is, they're talking to me about people who are prominent in the LGBT plus community and people who have devoted their lives to gay rights and civil rights in general, and who have made a real mark on the world as a result of their work. But I feel like that belongs in a separate book, that there should be a separate book about, people who've worked for gay rights. I do have Harvey Milk and a few, but if I included all the people who are prominent in the LGBT plus community,
particularly now,
right. I just don't have. I have to limit it somehow.
Yeah.
And 1,000 is really a lot.
And if we already know about somebody, it's maybe less impact, isn't it?
Right. If a lot of very prominent out gay people in today's society are not in the book, because you can easily find out about them elsewhere. So the book is meant to be the ones that are a little harder to find.
So you're still collecting?
like I said, those guys in that 26,000-year-old burial, they may wind up in my book eventually.
So this is an ongoing project, right?
I wish it weren't, but I don't go through a day where I don't have one thought. I try not to think about it anymore, but I still have some work to do on it, I suppose.
You're here in London,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're staying with your friend, Ian McKellen. Tell us about your friendship. How did you meet?
Well, we met in Hollywood, in Los Angeles, and he was filming. Then he was going to go on and do Gods and Monsters for Bill Condon, and he had about 3 or 4 weeks in between the two films, and he wasn't going to go back home and come back. So he stayed in Los Angeles, and being a workaholic, he decided he would do a one-man show for charity. And we had met at a party. I had green hair at the time. He remembered me, and he knew I knew something about computers. So he called me up, and he said, I'm doing this show, and I need to get a computer here and get it set up so that I can work on the script for my one-man show. So I got him set up, and we were just talking about stuff, and I mentioned that I was working on websites. I had done one, for instance, for Spinal Tap.
Excellent.
And he said, well, that sounds interesting. Why don't you do a website for the show? And we put this website up. This was 1997. And it was quite a success because if he would do a one-man show in L.A., he could easily sell out the auditorium just on the local people. But because of the website, he had people coming in from Boston and Dallas and all over the country were coming in to see this show. And he was mightily impressed. And so he said, well, why don't you do a website for me? I said, sure, Ian. Give me your CV. So he handed me like one piece of paper with double-spaced typing on both sides. It listed, a few plays, a few movies. And I thought, well, yeah, that's enough of a career. I can do a website on that. And he asked me how long it would take. I said, well, about 3 weeks. Give me about 3 weeks to do it. And so here we are 28 years later, and we're still working on it.
Is that right? His CV's longer than 2 sides of A4 paper, that's for sure.
It was longer than that then, but he didn't give me the full thing. He didn't want to scare me out.
Is that
scare
right?
me off, I think.
Right? So the question is, I was told earlier on today that there is a whole internet thing about this, which maybe you could ask him, or maybe you know, is that, was Gandalf queer?
Was Gandalf queer? Well, he did like hanging out with the boys. He really did like hanging out with the boys. We know of no particular female love interest of Gandalf. And I can tell you that the underwear that Gandalf wore during filming of Lord of the Rings, which I happen to own, the wardrobe department wrote the word Gandhi to identify it, Gandy. And so his underwear is pretty gay. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that answers my question. Good. Yeah, very good. Well, Keith Stern, I want to thank you for your dedication to this subject over 35 years plus in producing these now 2 volumes. I'm sure it's going to extend to 3, and it's probably going to end up like the Encyclopaedia Britannica and a whole shelf.
Just put it on the coffee table and see how long it lasts.
It's out in my place all the time. First thing people go for. I put one of my own books next to it, hoping that people might pick them up.
Sorry.
To go straight past it. It's a fantastic, very moving, very funny, entertaining read, and a valuable contribution to the culture, so that some of these stories which were lost culture are now part of the mainstream. And I want to thank you, Keith, for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Well, thank you for being so encouraging to me. I appreciate that very much.
Thank you so much to Keith. Whatever your orientation is, I recommend this book. Every time someone sees my copy, they pick it up. It takes me ages to get it back. A very good Christmas stocking filler, I would suggest, although you're going to need a big stocking or a pair of them. Thank you to my recent correspondents, Mark, Olivia, Owen, Nancy and Nigel. Some great suggestions. Keep them coming. You can join them. Join us, bureauoflostculture.com. if you've got any ideas for lost, secret or forgotten histories of your own. Thanks to Soho Radio. Thanks to you for listening. Let's keep listening. And I will see you, hear you, meet you further down the road, round the bend and over the hillsides for more of these tales from the underground, from the other side. Here's a tune by the Real Tuesday World to play us out.